Well, for the next hour, they're going to be the views of Joel Skousen from World Affairs Brief, and he's going to bring us up to date on what is really going on in the world today. The news behind the news, the story behind the story. Hi, Joel. How are we doing?
Just fine, Dr. Stan.
Okay, well, what are the stories for today, for this week?
Well, I think we'll start out with the collapse predictions reaching a crescendo. You know, I do a lot of consultations for people around the country who have bought my book, Strategic Relocation, from you. And of late, somewhere in that conversation, every single client invariably asks me if I think economic collapse is imminent. And that's all they hear about on the Internet, from Alex Jones, Lindsey Williams, Gerald Celente, Steve Quayle, Doug Hagman, Bill Deagle, and many others. Despite my attempt last week in the World Affairs Brief to bring calm to the Internet rumors of government, quote, government preparing for collapse, none of my fellow commentators on the right seem to be listening. The stories and predictions of imminent monetary and banking collapse, followed by martial law, seem to grow each day as one commentator relies on the other's story to build their case. It culminated in a red alert this week by Alex Jones warning about U.S. big banks being warned by government to prepare for collapse by October of this year. And I give a link in the brief to where that warning is on YouTube. But there's a problem. This is based upon a Reuters article about a 2-year-old investigation into these rumors. Through the FOIC request, they found out that each of the too-big-to-fail banks, like Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan Chase, had been requested to develop, quote, living will-type transition plans in case they failed, and how they would like to see their assets transferred. It makes no mention of October, and there isn't any reason to suspect from the article that the Fed or the banks are expecting an imminent collapse of the banking system. What it really implies is that the insider banks want to make sure there's an orderly transfer of their assets to other big banks should they fail. In other words, it's more of keep the money in the family preparation than fear of losing control of the world's monetary system. Nevertheless, each of the largest talk show hosts on the constitutional right seem to be reinforcing each other's referencing of anonymous, unnamed sources within government who keep feeding them this information. Time and again in the past, these sources have been proven to be wrong, and that's why I suspect they're disinformation experts trying to make our leaders in the movement look foolish. And I'm sure you remember, as I do, the Christian law enforcement officer who overheard FEMA officers telling county officials about an imminent bank holiday coming. That was in August of 2010, and it turned out to be totally bogus. Bob Champman thought that rumor was valid. Steve Quayle promoted it, made Alex Jones, Doug Hagman, and all the rest, and never once did I hear any apology from them when they found out they'd been snookered. And we all remember the Doug Hagman government source who recently claimed that patriotic high-ranking officers in the military are planning a coup to take down these globalist leaders. And that, too, is bogus.
All right, well, you certainly go right ahead. I certainly agree with you that there's a great deal of disinformation up there on the Internet. It's so hard to be able to separate truth from falsehood.
Well, you know, not only will this not happen, the military is full of yes-men at the top. There aren't any of them that oppose to this globalist marching orders. But if the source was telling the truth, he would have killed the plan by announcing it on radio, and all the conspirators for liberty would have been found out and dead by now.
I think that, of course, is absolutely true. And if anything like that were really going on, it would have the utmost of secrecy. Well, we're going to be back in just a moment with Joel Skousen right here at Radio Liberty. Well, this is Dr. Stan here at Radio Liberty. I guess this afternoon, as every Thursday afternoon at this time, is Joel Skousen. And Joel is simply commenting on the fact that there's a great deal of disinformation up on the Internet and being put out even by certainly good people within the conservative and religious movement. But many times are being fed false information. And, of course, one of the issues that keeps being put out at the present time, according to Joel, is the fact that there is an imminent collapse of the monetary system. And, of course, they keep putting out times, and it's going to happen in a week or 2 or 3 weeks or a couple of months, and yet it never seems to happen. So you pick up the story from there, Joel.
Well, Alex Jones is covering himself by saying that this banking collapse doesn't have to happen. If we give this enough publicity, he says the powers that be cover will be blown and they won't really do this. No real nefarious plan, however, of government has ever been revealed before, and so there is no historical precedent for this claim that outing this plan, will stop it. But it will allow predictors to excuse themselves when this doesn't happen, rather than to apologize for spreading unfounded rumors. And I am personally of the opinion that we need more apologies and less talk about this hype, so that we quell this feeling like if you're not hyping something about imminent collapse, and once you start to do that, what do you say the next day? People are listening on the edge of the chairs for more information, and you keep feeding it to them, and pretty soon you get discredited. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not debunking this pattern of disinformation because I dislike Alex or any other of the big audience talk show hosts. I think they do a great service most of the time. I just don't want them or the movement to be discredited by this hype. It's time the right settled down to analyze more carefully how the powers that be operate and why they won't pull off a collapse or a martial law without probable cause, and at least one that appears probable to the public. Yes, a banking shutdown would provide that rationale, but would also collapse the economy, and they would get the blame, and so would Obama, and who they want to reelect. It just doesn't make sense. Yes, they could certainly pull something like this, but I don't see any reason why they would do it and convince people that there's, and it would only end up convincing people that there's a huge conspiracy in government. It's too early to do what World War III will someday do for them and provide them the cover for it so they don't get the blame. And that's been my prediction for a long time, that these martial law and other scenarios
The thought, please.
will only come when war comes.
Well, this is Dr. Stan, and Sidney Joel is saying that he believes, of course, the economic collapse will come concomitant with the coming war, which is coming, and he feels that this is some years off, but that there will be a major world war, and that will be used as a cover for the financial collapse, but they will hold it off until that time. Go right ahead, Joel.
Well, I think that's very important to understand, because clearly they have been working to cover for Russian and Chinese military preparations for decades. And that can only mean that one of their big agendas is to have a world war. And why else would they be covering for it when it's coming? They know it's coming. They're building huge underground bunkers preparing for war. Those bunkers aren't being built for some random terrorist attack. They know the war is coming, and I'm convinced that that's the time that they're going to pull the plug on.
And I think that's really very important for people to stop and think about. There are massive underground bunkers all networked across America, certainly at the Denver airport, but certainly all throughout the country. There are these massive underground bunkers that are completely supplied in preparation for a coming cataclysmic event. Certainly I know there was a fellow with his PhD who wrote a couple of books about this, and they went after him. Last thing I heard, he was working as a window washer down in Arizona. Why? The last thing they want for the American people to know is that they have these massive underground shelters. Of course, the Bush family bought a 200,000-acre parcel of land down in Paraguay 4 or 5 years ago. Why would anybody buy 200,000 acres of land in Paraguay? Well, because they know there's going to be a cataclysmic event, and they don't want to be around here, especially when people begin going back and realizing, of course, that Prescott Bush helped to finance Adolf Hitler, and certainly George Herbert Walker Bush did everything he could to build up communist China, including after the Tiananmen Square atrocity where at least 10,000 people were killed, probably much more. How did we punish the Chinese communists? Why, we gave communist China most favored nation status, so they could trade more easily with us without having to pay tariffs. And certainly George W. Bush certainly did everything he could to bring in the radical agenda and to bankrupt America. So I can understand why they wouldn't want to be around when something bad happens. Why would they be certainly digging underground shelters or making preparations to leave the country? Go right ahead, Joel.
Well, let's switch topics now and talk about the Paul Ryan affair. Is he a conservative or a rhino Republican? I don't recall any vice president candidate getting more scrutiny, Stan, or taking more of a public drumming than Paul Ryan has after being announced as Mitt Romney's running mate. Every major pundit on the right and the left has weighed in on Ryan, and every major position and vote he's ever taken has been cataloged and analyzed. The result has been uniformly negative from the left, as expected, and almost as negative from the constitutional right. The near total rejection by the far right has to be disappointing to Romney and his establishment advisors, who were hoping to impress the Ron Paul faction of the party with Ryan's libertarian roots. But Ryan is clearly no Ron Paul. He is a Republican, but is he a Republican in name only, a rhino, or a real conservative? That's what my main lead story for tomorrow's World Affairs Brief. Well, on the left, Paul Ryan is the grand inquisitor of the House, wielding the mighty budget axe to gut all government programs dear to progressives. That phony title the media uses to lessen the public's distaste for socialism and the less government redistribution of wealth agenda. But the reality is otherwise. The Ryan budget cuts are nearly as tepid as the Obama budget proposals in terms of actually cutting the size of government. Both proposals have to go out 10 years to show any slowing in the growth of government at all. Neither actually shrink the size of government or balance the budget for 30 more years, and we know what chance that has of happening. Well, on the right, Ron Paul always cuts to the chase and clarifies reality for us. He told Congress the GOP budget by Ryan was anything but draconian. Mr. Speaker, he said, listening to the claims of the opponents of this budget, one would think it represented a full frontal assault on the welfare state and the entitlement system. However, in fact, with all respect to Shakespeare, the sound and the fury protesting this budget ultimately signifies nothing. Under this budget, the federal government, he said, will spend $3.5 trillion next year, while under President Obama's budget, the federal government would spend $3.8 trillion. The small difference between the congressional budget and the president hardly seems to justify the overheated rhetoric we hear emanating from both sides of the aisle. Even under the most optimistic scenario, this supposedly radical plan by Paul Ryan does not balance the federal budget until my 1-year-old granddaughter will be in college. Under less optimistic assumptions, my great-granddaughter will be almost 30 before she sees a balanced federal budget. And this assumes that Congress will adhere to this year's budget in future years, a dubious assumption since we cannot bind future Congresses to abide by our spending plan. Well, that's very well put, and rarely has a future Congress ever stayed within a past budget, and never in recent decades. The last time was during Clinton, when they were running a great big inflationary scheme within the government and the economy, and there ended up being a budget surplus. Well, there appears to be differences between the Ryan and Obama budgets, but in the large scheme of things, they are minor and focus on whether or not the nation will stoke the rich for a bit more income, as in Obama's plans, or whether tax rates will be, or to lower tax rates, but raise taxes by eliminating exemptions on business and self-employed, which is Ryan's plan. So in the brief, and I won't go through that here, I do give a comparison of income tax changes, corporate income tax, Medicare changes, Medicaid changes, defense spending changes, and the overall deficit. I will just summarize that deficit issue. The budget deficit currently stands about 7.8% of gross domestic product, or GDP. Ryan's plan calls for the federal deficit to be reduced to 4% of GDP by 2014 and 0.9% by 2017. Obama's plan is less aggressive and calls for a reduction of 3.9% of GDP by 2014 and 3% by 2017. Notice that there's no actual cut, only a slowing in the growth of the deficit. They're cutting the growth of the deficit, they're not cutting government. It's interesting that the Republican Liberty Caucus from Ryan's home state of Wisconsin asked the crucial question, does Paul Ryan record match his rhetoric, especially on the debt issue? Representative Ryan is consistently being promoted as the social media networks and by the Republican Party as the free market groups for the champion of free market group and Americans for Prosperity. The fact is that Congressman Ryan voted with George W. Bush 94% of the time. It appears that when Paul Ryan's party is doing the spending, raising debt limits, and acting unconstitutionally, Ryan goes with the flow. And I think that's what we're seeing.
And he certainly seems to support both the welfare state and the warfare state. And he's not against the welfare programs. He's certainly not about doing away with the American empire. Go right ahead.
Well, the issue Ryan is most known for is interest in cutting the deficit and balancing the budget. But why did the congressman vote to bail out the auto industry, to pass the Medicare package to the tune of $400 billion, and to nationalize education via No Child Left Behind? He also voted for the TARP thing in 2008, on the economic stimulus, gift to all Americans in 2008, on the $15 billion bailout of GM and Chrysler, on the $192 billion anti-recessional stimulus. So he voted for both stimulus, which were both very inflationary after you pumped $180 million into the pockets of every American. He also voted yes on limited prescription drug benefit for Medicare recipients. That cost billions. Voted yes on providing $70 million in Section 8 housing vouchers, costing $70 million, on extending unemployment benefits to 59 weeks, on the Head Start Act. He went along with the Bush administration supporting more federal involvement in education, voted for No Child Left Behind. On civil liberties, he voted yes on federalizing rules for driver license to hinder terrorists, which is a very bad point of view, allowing us to get closer to a federal ID card. He voted yes on making the Patriot Act permanent. That's unforgivable for someone who claims to be a conservative. Yes on allowing electronic surveillance without warrant, also unforgivable. Paul Ryan also voted yes on military opposition in Iraq. Yes on emergency $78 billion for war in Iraq and Afghanistan. Voted yes on declaring Iraq part of the war on terror with no exit date. Voted no on deploying U.S. troops out of Iraq starting in 90 days. So Congressman Ryan supports the UN, the World Trade Organization, federal bailouts, increased federal involvement in education, unconstitutional and undeclared wars, Medicare Part B, stimulus spending, and federal aid, and foreign aid. So it's quite a story. Milwaukee blogger Nick Schweitzer wrote, "We ought to be apologizing for his previous vote, not pretending he was being responsible the whole time. But I don't see one bit of regret for what he did previously, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let him get away with it." Congressman Ryan, he said, "If you don't like debt, stop voting for debt." Well, yes, that is, Dan, one of the key issues. If Romney and Ryan really believe in stopping this path to debt destruction, they need to stop voting for the programs and expenditures that make up that total debt. Of course, the trouble is with that no single vote constitutes debt. It isn't deficit spending until the end of the year when suddenly the totals exceed revenue. And it's only when you run up all the totals that it appears as debt. No one votes for that total, just the individual parts. The only time we get to see them vote for more debt is when they have to go through the annual ritual of raising the debt ceiling. A true conservative will never vote to raise the debt ceiling, because that's the only balanced budget tool we have or are ever likely to get. And, I say, they always say when it comes up, well, the sky's going to fall, and if we don't do it, I say let it fall. It's going to come down any time soon, and the further we postpone it, the bigger the consequences will be.
And I think it's important for people to understand that what you're seeing is all smoke and mirrors. Supposedly, there's a fight between the radical leftists and the conservatives here at this election, and basically, they're all in favor of continuing the war. They're all in favor of continuing and funding the welfare state. Oh, they may make a few little changes here and there, but nobody's suggesting that we should turn away from socialism, from an all-powerful government, and, of course, from the American empire, which is the basis of so many of our problems today. We'll be right back with Joel Skousen. Joel, you go right ahead.
Well, there's been a lot of claims that America, through this 4-year-long recession, has been deleveraging its debt. But that is only true to a degree in the private sector. As ZeroHedge.com explains, over the past several years there has been much speculation and numerous reports that America is deleveraging its debt. It isn't. In fact, consolidated across 5 different kinds of American debt, which take into account not only federal debt, but also financial, municipal, household, and non-financial, total debt as a percentage of GDP has not budged over the past 4 years and is a flat 350% of gross domestic product. 350%. That simply means that all of the household debt that is supposedly vaporized, at least until the next major flow of funds revision, all of which has taken place purely from the discharges of uncollectible mortgages and credit card debt, has been replaced by federal debt, while financial debt has merely soared to take the place of collapsing shadow debt, which is imploding as confidence in the Fed-free financial system erodes to zero. So isn't that interesting? That private debt has a lot of it has been liquidated and deleveraged, and a lot of people are going into less debt, less credit card debt. But the total debt remains the same because the federal government is filling up that void with their own debt and pumping more money into the economy, but it's not doing much because obviously most of their money that they create is going into the speculative economy through the big banks. It gets invested in the stock market, in the derivatives, the hedge funds, and the Forex market. So taking a look at the rest of Ryan's record, as reflected in various indices, National Right to Life gives him a 100% rating. Now, as a conservative Catholic, Ryan is fully against abortion, which I applaud. National Farm Bureau gives him a 60 to an 80%. This includes voting for some farm program subsidies, which I disagree with. Arts Action Fund rates him 0 to 5%. That means he votes against federal subsidies for the arts. That's good. Civil Liberties for Minorities, he gets a 0 to a 30 rating. Not real. These are not real civil liberties, but preferential treatment for minorities, which are bad. Eagle Forum rating is a 53%. That went down from an 87%. Now, that's a pretty good rating because Eagle Forum has turned into a very solidly constitutional conservative organization. The NEA rating, National Education Association rating, is an F, even though he voted for No Child Left Behind. That shows how radical the NEA is, when they can even give him an F for when he voted for No Child Left Behind. Federation for Immigration Reform, that's a anti-amnesty rating. They give him 100%, so he's not for supporting amnesty. That doesn't mean he wouldn't compromise in that regard, I think, if a Republican president supported it. On senior issues, he gets a low rating, 0 to 13%. He's not pandering to the elderly's call for more welfare. On military issues, he's rating 90 to 100%. That means he supports most neocon positions, even though he's not a globalist. On social issues, according to the Family Research Council, he gets a 90%. Family Research Council, however, is a Bush Republican crowd, not as good as rating as the Eagle Forum rating, in my opinion. Gun Owners of America give him a D, which is surprising, down from 100% in 2011, and he declined to 75%. I'm sorry, in 2010 he got 100%. In 2011, 75, and now he's down to a D rating, which says he's leaning towards an anti-gun position. That's disturbing. NRA still gives us an A, but they're not as reliable as Gun Owners of America.
Hold that thought. We'll be back in just a moment here. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and Joel was simply going through a number of various organizations and how they've rated him, and so the organizations like Eagle Forum gave him maybe a 53% favorable rating. He seems to be very much pro-life. He's always been strong pro-gun till recently, and simply his support for gun ownership seems to be faltering. And so the radical left gives him certainly a very, very low rating. Conservative groups give him a moderate rating. Go right ahead.
Well, let's ask, what can we learn from all this? Is Ryan a conservative who has lost his way, or a sellout wolf in sheep's clothing, as some claim? Pastor Chuck Baldwin came down hard on Romney and Ryan in his latest column, saying, neocon rhino George H.W. Bush picked conservative Dan Quayle, and my comment is, who underwent no scrutiny similar to Ryan because Quayle was too much of a nobody, to be a threat to anybody. Conservative George W. Bush picked neocon rhino Dick Cheney. My comment, yes, Cheney had long ago joined the globalists and was only pretending to be a conservative. Neocon rhino John McCain picked conservative Sarah Palin, who I say is someone who had legitimate libertarian conservative roots, but not the intellectual or moral courage to see that she was being used and still is being used. Now, he says, neocon rhino Mitt Romney picks, quote, conservative Paul Ryan. Well, I have a slight disagreement with Baldwin's label on Romney, and my analysis will similarly apply to Paul Ryan. Romney is not a true neocon. Neither is Ryan, even though they both seem to be bending over backward to please the establishment by promoting a neocon foreign policy. My point is that they are ignorant of the underlying neocon globalist agenda. If there is any serious guilt, it is because they both want to remain ignorant so they don't have to have a fit of conscience over what this conspiracy to destroy government sovereignty is all about. Neither has Romney nor Ryan been part of that conspiracy to fake left, and this is what a neocon is, they fake their left liberal credentials and knowingly falsify the switch to conservative in order to push an aggressive interventionist foreign policy. And they do this because they're globalists. They are wolves in sheep's clothing, and it only fits those who work this deception knowingly, like Bill Kristol, Gene Kirkpatrick, and the rest of the leftists who switched to being Republicans and worked their way into the Bush administration to carry out this devious plan. The agenda, of course, is to create war and hatred against the United States so as to eventually spur Russia and China to attack the West as the bullies of the world. That is, claiming that the West are the bullies of the world, and that's the reputation we build. The more we intervene, we look like bullies around to the rest of the world. Now, so I'm trying to make a distinction between Romney and Ryan, who are knowing or unknowing dupes of the real neocons, and it doesn't do any good to call them neocons as if they were knowingly deceiving, because they're not. If there's any guilt, as I say, it's because they willingly remained ignorant of these things. They don't dare read conspiratorial literature lest they be laughed at by the press or ridiculed. Now, that said, it makes little difference to the loss of our liberty if a potential president is a true neocon or just blindly following his neocon advisors, leading him towards greater war in the New World Order. But it does make a difference to the powers that be. In other words, we can lose our freedom either through a blind president following neocon advice or through a real neocon, like George W. Bush. But it does make a difference to the powers that be if they get into office. They don't like to have people in high position who might see illegal acts and object to them. People who have a vestige of principles left in them, who might have a fit of conscience with what they see happening on the White House. And that's why I believe that they have tried to stop Romney from getting the nomination. Now, even though Kennedy was put into office by the kingmakers, and he was their puppet to begin with, and was not a moral person, he did refuse to act as a puppet, and he threatened to shut down much of the CIA's illegal activities that bothered him. They had to have him killed in order to stop that. Now, neither Romney or Ryan are on the dark side, and that worries the establishment. That is why they've tried to stop Romney both in 2008 and in 2012. Now, don't mistake their current efforts to appear to back him now that the nomination is assured as a sign that he's totally compromised or part of the evil system. There's a big difference between trying to control somebody once they get the nomination and being on the inside. I hope I make myself clear.
Well, I think you do, Joel. And basically, of course, the thing is that Romney is not an insider, but I think that certainly that he is controlled. I suspect he is totally surrounded by people who do belong to or are affiliated with the Brotherhood of Darkness, and that certainly if he becomes president, he will continue the globalist programs. And, of course, if he doesn't, he'll end up just like Jack Kennedy did, because the people who run the world today have a goal and objective, and that is a one-world government, a one-world financial system, the destruction of Christianity, and, of course, the bring about of this world government under this one world leader. We'll be back in just a moment.
While the storm clouds gather far across the sea, let us swear allegiance to a land that...
Joel, you go right ahead.
Well, neither Romney nor Ryan, as I said, are on the dark side, and the reason is significant. The powers that be don't have any significant dirt on either Romney nor Ryan. Nobody is allowed on the inside unless they have a significant history of immorality and the abuse of principles. Blackmail is an essential control feature necessary to keep conspirators under control. Now, what Romney and Ryan and Ronald Reagan all have in common, though, is even though they have good gut feelings that are conservative, and good religious backgrounds that are conservative, They have a history of compromise of their principles, not necessarily moral ones, but political ones, and liberty principles that they've compromised, either as governor or as congressman. Governor Reagan made some severe compromises, including to the gun lobby when he was there in California as governor. And Romney made the severe compromises in order to get elected there in a liberal state by, saying good things about the homosexuals and about the free choice, the pro-choice movement, etc., which he, had to regret later on. And Ryan, as I said, has a record of compromise as well. But as I say, blackmail is an essential control feature necessary to keep conspirators under control, and I think they have files on about 75 to 80% of people in Congress, and most judges as well, and I think that's how they keep a lot of them under control. Although it is important to distinguish who is corrupt, a corrupt insider, from those who are going along because they're trying to please the establishment, the ignorant ones trying to please can actually be more dangerous to our liberty than the corrupt ones like Cheney and Bush, who are actual insiders. Romney and Ryan can be more believable than Cheney, and good people can sense they aren't corrupt. Hence, they're more trusting of someone like Romney and Ryan with good family and religious background. That is why Pastor Chuck Baldwin said, as long as there is one conservative on the ticket, conservative in quotes, mushy-headed conservatives across the country will go gaga, starry-eyed, in hypnotic trance in support of the Republican ticket. And he's right. That is why I'm not afraid to vote for a third party, even if it means Obama gets reelected. He can't do much more damage than he and the courts have already done, but a Romney could convince a lot more conservatives to go along with war and deficit spending than Obama could. When Republicans are in office, the conservatives go to sleep and stop fighting the direction of government. We lose certain liberties under Democrats, like the Obamacare, and others under Republicans, like the Patriot Act. But we never go to the right direction under either party. I'll repeat that I think the powers that be are intending to not let Romney into the White House. I don't believe the trumped-up essays talking about rebellion against Romney at the convention are going to happen.
Hold the thought. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and Joel was simply saying, quoting, Joel was simply quoting Chuck Baldwin, saying that he probably would vote for a third-party candidate, even though it would mean that Obama could get back in the White House. Because certainly everybody would know Obama was the enemy, whereas, of course, if Romney got in, why, they would not know he was the enemy, and he would still continue these same policies. And as it was with Ronald Reagan, when Ronald Reagan became president, why, the conservatives went to sleep, as Ronald Reagan, unfortunately, promoted so many of the globalist policies and actually massively expanded the size of government and government spending, although most people don't even understand. He gave us the biggest tax increases in the history of our nation. Go right ahead, Joel.
Well, he did. There are rumors and a lot of wishful thinking among arch conservatives that there's going to be a Ron Paul rebellion at the Tampa Republican Convention. But, Ron Paul rebellion would be the worst of the establishment's nightmares, and they aren't about to let that happen. They're really working to control it. I think they're trying to finagle a Ron Paul endorsement of Romney in exchange for a speech, but that's not going to happen. I reported last week that they had agreed they were going to give Ron Paul a slot, but it hasn't happened yet. That means they're in the negotiations, and I'll bet that's about trying to get him to endorse Romney. And I just don't think Ron Paul's going to do it. That means there'll be no speech, or they'll relegate him to a slot that's dark 30 where no one's watching. Well, the real key issue of this election should be the fact we have runaway government police power and the loss of civil liberties, and the question, who will stop it? Well, Paul Craig Roberts certainly doesn't mince words about it. He says the real issue can be found nowhere on the campaigns or in the media. There's no media attention of the Bush-Obama destruction of the U.S. Constitution and its legal protection of citizens from arbitrary government power. And I would hope that that's what your listeners really understand. I mean, look at last May, Federal District Court Judge Catherine Forrest ruled that the indefinite detention of U.S. citizens is unconstitutional and issued an injunction against the Obama regime using this police state against enforcing that provision of the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA. Well, the Obama regime gave the federal judge the proverbial finger, and during the week of August 6th through 10th, The Justice Department's brown shirt lawyers said that Paul Craig Roberts refused to tell Judge Forrest if the Obama regime was complying. The position of the Obamas was, we are above the law and we're not going to tell the federal court. You have no ability to enforce your provisions, so we're just going to thumb our nose. One would think, of course, that Romney would be all over this issue, but he isn't. Paul Craig Roberts says because he wants the power himself. Actually, I don't agree with that. I think Romney, as I said, is being blind to the issue because he fears treading anywhere the media or the establishment that he wants to please will disapprove of. Well, they'll, of course, shop for a judge higher up that will be able to overturn Forrest things, but they're not about to, give up these powers that they have given, and they keep reinforcing them, with false flag patriot acts and all kinds of phony wars they trump up.
Well, before we go on, Joel, I want you to go ahead and get your website out, tell people how they get in touch with you, and subscribe to the World Affairs Brief, and get your excellent books on survival and certainly how to begin to prepare for the very difficult times that do lie ahead. Go ahead. Thanks, Dan.
My World Affairs Brief is on my website, www.worldaffairsbrief.com. That's World Affairs, plural, brief.com. And people can get a free sample issue of what we're talking about today by emailing me at editor@worldaffairsbrief.com. My books are showcased on my other website, joelskousen.com, spelled JOELSKOUSEN. My top-selling book is Strategic Relocation, North American Guide to Safe Places. It's in its third edition, all-new color edition with color maps of every state and province in America and Canada. And I also have an entirely new section on international retreating. Cover all of the threats that one would like to encounter, all of the various preparations that people need, even if they can't relocate or can't move, what kind of contingency plan do they need if they have to stay within a major metropolitan area. My largest book and most long-standing book is The Secure Home. It's over 700 pages. Talks about everything from in high-security construction as well as self-sufficiency and energy self-sufficiency. So it's really a one-stop do-it-yourself manual for how to really prepare a home for troubled times. And my philosophy has been while we fight for our liberty and try to retain our liberty, that we ought to prepare for a takedown just in case we lose. And believe me, we keep losing, even if Republicans get elected. All of my books can be purchased from Radio Liberty.
By calling 1-800-544-8927. That's 1-800-544-8927. And Joel's books are among the best-selling books we carry. Go right ahead, Joel.
Well, the Israeli government has pulled out all the stops to convince their own public that an attack on Iran is both inevitable and necessary. All Israel is buzzing with rumors of war and making preparations. The war is coming, and everybody knows it. In an interview with AL Monitor's Laura Rosen, the Obama administration's former top Pentagon Middle East advisor, Colin Kahl, explains why he isn't writing off Israel's latest threats about Iran from key Israeli decision-makers as mere saber-rattling. Why are the arguments that it's not just saber-rattling more compelling, says Laura Rosen. Kahl replies, first, U.S. and European sanctions are nearly maxed out. So what additional benefit does the saber-rattling produce here? Second, the P5+1 process, that's the peace process with 5 nations, including Russia and the United States and France and several Middle Eastern countries, process is on hold for the moment, and a major breakthrough on the accelerated timeline envisioned by the Israelis is not likely to happen. Not to mention the fact that some Israeli decision-makers seem skeptical of the benefits of diplomacy, period. Third, despite the saber-rattling, the Iranians don't fear an Israeli strike. Well, my comment is they will after they read my brief. So Tehran isn't likely to make a concession in the near term just because of an Israeli threat. What the Iranians really see as a threat is American military technology because it has so much more weapon firepower than Israel has to bring to bear. But from what I'm going to tell you just now in this leak that came out of Israel, the firepower that Israel has is a lot more than what I thought it was. Finally, the Israelis, he said, would seem to know that the prospect of a U.S. strike before the election is very low, regardless of their posture. This is not primarily, he says, for political reasons, as some suggest, but because Iran is not likely to cross U.S. red lines this year. And he's absolutely wrong about that, in my opinion. It is purely for political reasons. The Obama administration doesn't want to get caught in a war before the election, which might be very unpopular. And they need to await the destruction of the Syrian military so that Israel is spared Syrian retaliation as an ally of Iran. So the prospect of an Israeli attack is unlikely to drive Obama to war before November. And I think that's true, but it's more so because of the political risk and the Syrian problem. Excuse me. So I think it is more likely, he says, that Israeli leaders are preparing the Israeli public for a strike and creating a narrative for the international community that, quote, diplomacy and sanctions have failed. Well, they're always intended to fail. The only reason they go through this rigmarole of diplomacy and sanctions is so they can say we've tried every peaceful avenue and now we have no choice but to exercise the military option.
But I think the average Israeli doesn't want to go to war with Iran any more than the average American in 1941 wanted to go to war with either Japan or Germany. It is the fact that the leaders are intent upon the war. And what they have to do now is convince the Israeli that it's absolutely necessary for their safety, which it isn't. I think that there are terrible complications that could develop, if there were to be an attack at this time. What are your thoughts?
Well, I certainly agree with you. There's never been a time where the people have really been anxious to go to war. They try to drum up that, of course, through agent provocateurs, just like Hitler did in trying to put out, that several Germans were killed by Czechoslovakian or Poles, and therefore we've got to go to war in order to protect our citizens in those other countries. And that will be used again and again, including by the Russians, who keep millions of Russians tucked into the Balkans, or as well as mostly the Baltic states and the Ukraine and Belarus and other things as well, so that they can attack them at some point, have an excuse to re-invade their republics. Now, there's been a serious leak of government war plans, Israeli government war plans, that specifically outlines much of the strategy they intend to use, and it is in line with what I know about Israeli war potential and their extensive capability. Richard Silverman of antiwar.com had the story, and this is a significant leak. In the past few days, he said, I received an Israeli briefing document outlining Israel's war plans against Iran. The document was passed to me by a high-level Israeli source who received it from an IDF officer. My source, in fact, wrote to me that normally he would not leak this sort of document, but these are not normal times. He said, I'm afraid Bibi and Barak, that's Bibi Netanyahu and Ehud Barak, defense minister, are dead serious. The reason the source leaked it is to expose the arguments and plans advanced by Bibi and Barak, two-headed warrior. Neither the IDF leaker, my source, nor virtually any senior military or intelligence officer wants this war. Just what you were saying, Stan. Well, whoever wrote this briefing paper had use of IDF and intelligence data. I don't believe the IDF itself wrote it. It feels more like it came, says Silverman, from the shop of National Security Advisor Yaakov Amidror, a former general, settler, true believer in Bibi confidant. It would also have been could have been produced by Defense Minister Barak, another war booster. He said, I've translated the document from Hebrew with the help of Dana Shunra, and this is good information because one of the signs of its authenticity is it comes in Hebrew, not in English. In other words, it's not pre-prepared to be a leak. It's traceable. We can talk to the translator and see if it sounds authentic. He says this is Bibi's, and once again, this is Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, sales pitch for war. Its purpose is to be used in meetings with members of the Shimniya. The 8-member Security Council currently finds a 4-3 majority opposed to an Iran strike. It's trying to convince them. Bibi uses this sales pitch to persuade recalcitrant members of the cool, clean, refreshing state of war. My source, he says, informs me that it has been shared in confidence with selected journalists who are in the trusted media inner circle. And he says, who might that be? Of course, that means New York Times and Washington Post. This is shock and awe Israeli style. It's a BB effort to convince high-level Israeli officials that Israel can prosecute a purely technological war that involves relatively few human being casualties who may be put in harm's way and cost as few lives as possible. BB's sleight of hand here involves no mention whatsoever of the Iranian counterattack against Israel. The presumption must be that the bells and whistles of all those marvelous new weapon systems would decapitate Iran's war-making ability and render it paralyzed. The likelihood of this actually happening, he says, is nil. And actually, I disagree. I think, in fact, that is the sign of a true leak, of a true military plan. Both the U.S. and Israel are planning on decapitating all of Iran's military capability and its civilian infrastructure to make it almost impossible to carry on a war. The Israeli military is very much afraid of retaliation, especially from Syria and Lebanon, and that's why the U.S. is intent on taking Syria down this month. There will be those, he says, who will dispute the authenticity of this document. I'm convinced that of what my source claims based upon his prior track record and the level of specificity offered in this document. And I, too, feel that it sounds very, very real.
Well, you know, basically, as I've read this, and I certainly agree with you, it sounds very real, but the whole idea, we're just going to have just this brief little war. It reminds me, of course, what they said during the Boer War, and in London they were saying, this is the British troops at war in South Africa, they said, our troops will be home by Christmas. I mean, they called it Milner's War. Our troops will be home by Christmas. They just didn't say what Christmas. It was 3 long, bloody years. Same thing happened in Korea, you remember? So they... General MacArthur, our troops will be home by Christmas. Well, I
still believe, Stan, that they don't intend to invade. I think it's very important.
I think you're absolutely right, but what happens if it doesn't work as well as they expect? In other words, they think they're going to so destroy Iran that they won't be able to retaliate. Suddenly, I hope they're correct, but what happens if they're wrong? Go ahead.
No, I do think that there will be a retaliation. I don't think you're going to be able to completely decapitate Iran's ability to retaliate, but I still don't think that there's ever going to be any need to attack. At any point, they can just launch, thousands and thousands of missiles and rockets at them and then say, we won. If you don't intend to invade and occupy, there's no proof that you didn't win. I mean, clearly, you'll have on television all of the destruction that they caused, and everyone could say that's a win. And certainly Iran will be, very hard-pressed to dig out from under all that rubble. So I think that's where they're headed. But the degree of uncertainty is clearly on how much of a regional war will be precipitated by this attack, how much retaliation, how much will be left in Syria or Lebanon or anyone else to hit Israel. I do think that Israel's going to take some hits on this. Certainly Lebanon is going to unleash everything they've got, which are thousands of small caliber rockets. They don't have very many big ones. And if Syria is taken down, that's the biggest threat to Israel right there. I mean, they've got over 1,000 major missiles with chemical and biological warheads that can do a great deal of damage. And the Israeli military has already said that we're not going to use our Arrow anti-missile system to protect civilians, only our military targets.
And of course, Syria could always transport those missiles over to Lebanon if it looked like they're going to fall. So I think these are very, very dangerous times. I share your concern.
Well, the Israeli attack will open with a coordinated strike, including a cyber attack that would try to paralyze the Iranian regime. The internet, telephones, radio, television towers, communications, satellites, fiber optic, all of that will try to be destroyed. The electric grid throughout Iran will be paralyzed, probably through an EMP strike. They have conventional EMP strikes as well as nuclear transformer stations will absorb severe damage. From carbon fiber munitions, these are munitions finer than human hair that explode, and they're all magnetic so that the particles go into all the electronics and short them out. It's a really dangerous secret weapon. I didn't know until I read this that Israel had those. I knew the U.S. had those weapons, but this is real top-level stuff. A barrage of 10 ballistic missiles will be launched from Israel. 300-kilometer ranging missiles will be launched from Israeli submarines. They're going to do a lot of damage as well.
Well, I think we're living in very, very dangerous times because when you start a war, you're never really sure how it's going to end. Go right ahead.
Well, the barrage of hundreds of cruise missiles will pound command and control systems, research and development facilities, and residences of senior personnel. All of those are targeted now. After the first wave of attacks, which will be timed to the second, they'll have a satellite overfly according to the plan, and then U.S. or Israeli aircraft will launch and take out other targets that have survived those.
Hold that thought, as our attention's focused on sort of the Olympics and the upcoming baseball season. Very terrifying things are happening throughout the world, and we seldom talk about them. Go right ahead, Joel.
Among the targets approved for attack to the Shihab-3 sites, those are the intermediate range ballistic missiles, the Say-Jill ballistic missile silos, storage tanks for chemical compounds, rocket fuel, industrial facilities for producing missiles, centrifuge plants, and more. And I still think they're going to take down the entire power grid, too. The Israelis are posting a claim that the document I published is identical to a post published at Fresh a few days ago. It is not. My original IDF source may have leaked the post to someone at Fresh, which is another kind of intelligent leaking source, but whoever published it there embellished it with much material that is not in the original document. I can't ascribe motives to whoever published it afresh, but much of it appears to be fanciful and isn't in the original document, and it probably is meant to discredit what I am doing. What the plan doesn't mention is the U.S. is planning on backing up the Israelis with much more shock and awe as soon as the Iranian retaliation kills a few American troops, which are presently stationed in Kuwait, Iraq, Afghanistan, and half a dozen other countries ringing Iran. This is going to become a regional war, but not a world war. That comes much later.
All right, fine. And I certainly agree with you. Okay, we've got about a minute and a half for you to wrap up the program.
Yeah, I wanted to also just cover one short story. It didn't take long for the military to go from don't ask, don't tell to singing the praises of, the quote, the first gay officer to be promoted to the rank of general. Yes, and it's a double minority, both a woman and a lesbian. So it's a double minority, and the military is praising to the moon the great service that homosexuals have had in the service. So isn't it amazing, Stan, how quickly we go from this being a problem in the military, and it still is, believe me. I mean, you can't have unit morale in combat or even in close quarters with homosexuals without tension that really is a problem. But as I've long predicted, once the nation starts to go down the road to homosexuality, it becomes the rush, and it's going to be very damaging to the country.
And I think it's going to be terribly damaging to our military. Our military has always been different. They had different standards. I mean, certainly when you're asking people to go out and fight and bleed and suffer and die, they've got to believe in what they're doing. They have to believe in honor and integrity. And, of course, I do not believe that the average American soldier is going to willingly accept the leadership of a known homosexual who may very well be involved in pedophilia or sadism and masochism. 25% of homosexuals are involved in S&M, and nobody ever wants to talk about that or wonder why. Joel, thank you very much for being with us. It's always a pleasure. We'll look forward to having you as a guest with us again tomorrow morning.
Thank you very much, Dan. Bye.
God bless. Bye-bye. Okay, fine. It was Joel Skousen. We'll be back here in just a moment to wrap up today.